Hello, fellow investors, and welcome back to Borex Investing. Today's video is going to be about one of my favorite names in the tech space. It's a controversial company that I have been invested in since 2021. That company is Palantir. So, Palantir today is a very different company than it was just a few years ago. I feel like today the moat is wider, the product suite is stronger, and the financials are now at a level where you can confidently call this company a money printer. On their recent earnings, they just hit an incredible Rule of 40 score of 114. Margin profiles are expanding, and both commercial and government segments are delivering consistent revenue growth. The leadership is very stable and visionary, with Alex Karp guiding long term strategy, and the teams underneath are executing at a very high level. The business is becoming more efficient as it scales, and that's exactly what you want to see from a software company that's entering its prime years. So, a lot of people focus on Palantir's valuation and that high PE ratio, but I personally don't view that as a risk. Companies like Amazon traded at higher valuations during their scaling, and the market eventually adjusted as revenues grew and new customers came on board. So I think Palantir is in that exact kind of early scaling phase right now, especially as the incoming lower interest rates can really fuel enterprise software spending and accelerate adoption for many companies in the S&P 500. But even as I am a huge Palantir bull, I realize that no business is without risks. So in today's video, I wanted to go over what I see are the five biggest risks right now facing Palantir. And I'll also include a bonus risk at the end that I feel that investors should keep in mind. So let's get to it. Before we jump in, I do want to make a quick disclosure. I am a Palantir shareholder and have been for about 4 to 5 years now. I own thousands of shares. My position has more than 10x, and I regularly sell covered calls on my shares to generate income. I plan on continuing this strategy unless something fundamentally changes with the company. So that leaves me with the question: what could actually change my outlook? Well, these are the risks I am watching closely. So, risk number one: competitive pressure. We have to remember that Palantir is a software company in the government and enterprise space. Their software helps managers make key business decisions. In that sense, there are many softwares out there currently which assist management in making decisions. You have companies like Microsoft, IBM, Databricks, Amazon AWS, SAP, Tableau, and Snowflake, and they're all trying to solve adjacent problems in data integration and analytics. Some of them offer great tools, but none of them offer the full vertical stack that Palantir delivers. More importantly, none of them have anything close to Palantir's ontology, which is the core of their moat. The ontology lets orgs integrate data, logic, workflows, and real time operations into one unified system. This is one of the reasons so many of these companies work directly with Palantir via partnerships. This means Palantir is functioning as the operating system that sits above everything else and ties all of that information together. But in the future, that moat could be challenged. Competitors may try to replicate parts of the ontology or build their own end to end platforms as AI becomes the main revenue driver across the tech industry. And history proves that even dominant software companies can lose when innovation stalls. So I remember years ago when I was getting my master's degree, we learned about Siebel systems. So this was a Harvard Business Review case study where we learned Siebel had around 45% market share in CRM in the late 90s and early 2000s. But they did not innovate and they kept their software on large local on premise servers. When their competitor Salesforce came in and offered cloud SaaS services, it totally ate Siebel up. Now, I'm not saying a similar fate awaits Palantir, but with software, we have to remember that things can change very fast. And I think that's the case, especially now. Competition is evolving quickly as AI becomes the most valuable software category. Big companies are currently building AI stacks, and certain startups will eventually start positioning themselves as Palantir alternatives. So currently, Palantir's lead is large, but the market moves fast and they need to keep innovating to maintain that advantage. If there was a change or a new competitor who offered a better product, then that's when I would actually consider offloading my shares. But until that happens, we're good. All right, risk number two, a security or data incident. Palantir operates in one of the most security sensitive environments of any tech company on the planet. They work with defense agencies, intelligence agencies, hospitals, pharmaceuticals, critical infrastructure, and Fortune 500 enterprises. The trust these institutions place in Palantir is enormous. They plug Palantir directly into their most mission critical systems. In some cases, Palantir literally sits at the center of a country's national security decision making. Because of this, even a third party breach, meaning a customer system gets compromised, not Palantir's, can still reflect poorly on Palantir simply because of their involvement. We have to remember that security reputations aren't always logical. They're kind of like the stock market, they can be very emotional and perception driven. But to be clear, Palantir has one of the strongest security track records in the entire software industry. They built their platforms with security as the first principle. Gotham was designed for intelligence agencies, so this is the one company where security is not really an afterthought or a marketing line, it is the actual architecture. But that risk still exists. No system is completely invulnerable in a world where cyber attacks are increasing, nation state attackers are becoming more aggressive, and supply chain breaches are getting more and more sophisticated. I mean, we've seen this happen before, right? Companies that were considered incredibly secure were suddenly hit by unexpected 0 days vulnerabilities in third-party libraries or compromised vendor software. If you remember the solar winds hack, the breach didn't even come from the target organization, but from software updates in an external tool. So even when the vendor isn't directly at fault, the fallout can be huge. Companies lose customer confidence, governments pause new contracts, and reputations take time to rebuild. So again, I'm not saying this will happen to Palantir. Their track record is outstanding and their security culture is unmatched. But the sheer nature of their business means there's always a background risk investors need to acknowledge. It's no secret that Palantir's products are very expensive, but the entire value proposition of Palantir really depends on trust. So once that trust is questioned, even unfairly, the narrative can shift quickly. So that's why the risk is real and will always exist, even though Palantir is extremely well positioned to defend against it. All right, risk number three, potential leadership changes. So, now when you talk about Palantir, you can't separate the company from Alex Karp. He's definitely not a typical CEO. So, he's a founder with a very specific worldview, a philosophical foundation, and a long term strategy that really shapes almost everything that Palantir builds. And Alex Karp helped design the culture, the product philosophy, and the mission. So this is not really a CEO who just shows up for the earnings calls. He's been deeply involved in shaping how the company thinks about data privacy, governance, national security, and responsible AI. Investors trust Palantir partially because they trust him. They believe he will protect the culture, defend the long term vision, and avoid the short term thinking that destroys many tech companies. But remember, that being said, no leader stays forever. A sudden shift in leadership, especially if it happens unexpectedly, could introduce uncertainty. Markets don't react well to uncertainty, especially when a founder is seen as the intellectual anchor of the business. So, I'm not saying that Palantir needs Karp to survive. Clearly, the company has an extremely strong bench of leaders, including Shyam Sankar and the engineering teams behind Foundry and AIP. Sankar has been making more and more appearances on CNBC, so that's a good thing to get him used to investors just in case something happens. But losing Karp without a clear, structured, and well communicated succession plan would create tons of volatility. And we've seen this dynamic before. When Steve Jobs stepped away from Apple, they were ready because Tim Cook was already integrated into the structure. When Larry Page and Sergey Brin stepped back from Google, Sundar was their clear successor. So strong companies handle leadership transitions well, But the key is clarity. Investors want to know who is next in line and whether the core vision will remain intact. So with Palantir, the concern is that Karp is such a unique leader. He's unconventional, he's contrarian, he's deeply philosophical. Replacing him with a more traditional CEO could shift the culture towards short termism. Markets like predictability, and Palantir's long term trajectory relies on maintaining the culture and mission that Karp really created. So, by the way, I don't think this will happen anytime soon, but like I said, you have to be prepared for any scenario. If for some reason Karp would no longer be at the helm, I would hope that the succession plan would be very well thought out. All right, risk number four, government and political shifts. So, even though Palantir is rapidly expanding their commercial business, government work is still a meaningful part of the revenue mix. Government contracts tend to be large, long term, strategically important, and especially in defense, intelligence, cybersecurity, and public health. So, in my 2025 predictions, I actually said that Palantir would benefit from a Trump administration because the company historically had a lot of strong ties to some of the people in Trump's administration. So, Palantir has built really deep relationships with the Department of Defense, the Army, the Special Operations Command, and various intelligence agencies over years of collaboration. A government that prioritizes national security spending tends to be good for Palantir. But the flip side is also a risk. If the political environment shifts dramatically in the future, for example, if a very progressive anti-defense spending administration comes to power, that could potentially change priorities. Someone with a AOC style worldview may push for reducing defense budgets, targeting military tech spending, or shifting focus away from the type of projects that Palantir is typically involved in. Even if the government does not cancel existing contracts, political changes can affect timing, renewals, procurement, and future budget allocations. So government spending is incredibly sticky, but it's not invincible. And we've seen in the past that defense suppliers, cybersecurity firms, and intelligence contractors often experience volatility around election cycles because different administrations prioritize spending differently. Now, this doesn't mean that a change would suddenly cause Palantir to lose government revenue, but it does affect how predictable that part of the revenue stream would potentially be. So that's, by the way, why investors are so happy to see their commercial revenue grow. Another thing investors should understand is that government contracting moves slowly, even in stable political environments. Budgets get held up, negotiation take months, agencies go through audits, and sometimes Congress delays can, delay funding simply due to political infighting. So by the way, so far none of this has been a red flag for Palantir yet. If anything, their track record shows they are trusted across multiple administrations. I mean, they worked with Obama, Trump, Biden on different projects, so clearly the company has credibility across the political spectrum thus far, but I think this is still a real risk that has to be acknowledged. You never want a large portion of your revenue tied to something as unpredictable as politics. But the key takeaway is that Palantir's government business is strong today, arguably stronger than ever, but investors should understand how political cycles and budget environments can influence future growth. All right, risk number five, regulatory and compliance risk. So, as AI becomes more powerful and more widely adopted, global regulators are paying a lot more attention to how data is used, how models are trained, and how decisions are made. So, we're entering an era where AI governance and data privacy laws are evolving rapidly. Governments around the world are proposing frameworks for ethical AI usage, transparency, auditing, model explainability, and strict compliance around personal data. So, this obviously includes the EU AI Act, the US federal guidelines, and upcoming rules in places like the UK, Canada, and Australia. Some of these regulations, they can be a double-edged sword. So, on one hand, Palantir is extremely well positioned because their entire architecture already emphasizing governance, accountability, privacy, and controlled access to sensitive data. They've been building secure systems for government agencies for more than 15 years. So compliance is baked into the DNA of their platforms. But Despite those strengths, regulation still introduces uncertainty. New rules could slow down deployments, increase paperwork, or even force companies to change how much data they connect to, AIP, Foundry, or Gotham. So even if Palantir is fully compliant, customers may hesitate or delay integrations because they're just waiting for regulatory clarity. In some cases, stricter laws could limit certain types of analytics or restrict how AI models interact with data sets that contain confidential data or personal information. You might have clients who want to use AIP aggressively but are governed by strict internal policies that force them to move slowly. We've seen this happen in other industries. So, for example, GDPR in Europe slowed down a lot of cloud and analytics projects. So, it wasn't because the technology wasn't safe, it was just because companies had to re architect workflows to meet with new compliance standards. That very same dynamic could happen with AI, especially in Europe, where the region is really well known for all the crazy bureaucracy we have over here. Palantir's advantage is that they have the strongest governance tooling in the market, which actually makes them one of the safest partners for AI deployments. In many ways, some feel that regulation may end up strengthening Palantir because companies will need a highly controlled environment to stay compliant. But even with all those strengths, investors still need to recognize that new regulatory environments can slow decision making, create delays, and really limit certain types of data usage. So while Palantir is positioned better than almost any other AI company to deal with regulatory changes, the risk itself remains very real simply because the rules are not fully defined yet and governments move very, very slowly. All right, bonus risk number 6, the AI hype cycle risk. So, this final risk isn't really about Palantir's business, it's more about market psychology, and it's something we're pretty much experiencing right now. So, every time the AI sector gets overheated or the media starts talking about an AI bubble, all the companies in this category get lumped together, whether it makes sense or not. And you can see the correlation across the entire space. If Nvidia dips, obviously smaller AI names are going to dip harder. And if something happens with Meta and they start pausing their GPU spending, or let's say Google delays an AI rollout, the entire AI sector would react. Even companies that aren't directly connected to events like this can get caught in the crossfire, and Palantir is no exception. As we saw, they could post record revenues, amazing margins, and strong commercial growth, but if the market decides AI stocks are too hot, Palantir will be one of those names grouped in the sell off simply because of sector momentum. And we've seen this happen in many other industries. In the dot-com era, great companies with strong fundamentals crashed simply because investors were overreacting to the failures of companies with no revenue. In the SaaS boom from 2018 to about 2021, even profitable enterprise software companies fell 50 to 70% when interest rates rose, simply because they were grouped into the same category as unprofitable startups. And right now, we're clearly seeing the early signs of that same thing happening with the AI names. When big voices start using words like overvalued, AI bubble, or too much AI spending, every ticker with an AI narrative attached to it takes a hit. And it doesn't matter then if Palantir's financials are rock solid. It doesn't matter if their ARR is growing and their margins keep expanding. What matters in the short term is sentiment, not fundamentals. And that is the risk, sentiment. But again, this is not a long term business problem. This is a short term investor psychology problem. But for shareholders who watch the stock daily or sell options like myself, it can create a lot of noise and volatility. In my opinion, long term, this doesn't matter because the companies with real revenue, real customers, and real infrastructure, like Palantir, will separate themselves from the hype cycle over time. The market always goes through phases where it overreacts, and Palantir is part of the broader AI narrative, whether the correlation is logical or not. So, yes, the AI hype cycle risk is a real risk, but it's more about, I would say, surviving temporary sentiment swings than really anything fundamental about the company itself. All right, so even though I'm a huge Palantir bull and I think the company is positioned better than almost anyone else in the AI software space, It's still important to stay very aware of the real risks that come with a company growing this fast. So I am watching all of these risks closely because if any of them actually materialize, they could affect how I manage my position and my long term ownership strategy. So, none of this really changes my bullish outlook today, but it's always smart to stay informed and be prepared. All right, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe if you found this useful, and let me know in the comments which risk is the largest in your opinion for Palantir. Thank you.